The last time that we saw the Masters of Evil in the Reborn universe was in Avengers Volume 2, Issues 8 and 9. The lineup there consisted of the Black Knight, Radioactive Man, Claw, the Master of Sound, the Melter, and Whirlwind. This group of dorks assaulted the Avengers in their home, hoping that beating them would bring the Masters fame and fortune. Naturally, the Avengers beat them all handily, but then the heroes also split, leaving the Masters unguarded. Loki then showed up and, as part of his own plot, turned them all into energy and ate them. And that's pretty much all that we know about them. None of them were given real names, or had their powers introduced, or had a well-explained motive as to why they were evil, or how they had actually mastered evil. Part of that stems from author Rob Liefeld leaving the Avengers and incoming author Walt Simonson having to pick up that ball and then run with it. Another part is that Simonson had to close out Volume 2 of Avengers in 3 issues, as issues 12 and 13 were earmarked for crossovers. This version of the Masters wasn't really a group that could threaten the Avengers. But Loki was, so Simonson made Loki's story the big finale. Part of Simonson's comic fame comes from writing the Thor comic in the 80s, so he naturally favors that kind of character and those kind of storylines. The Masters actually could have been a good final challenge. They had the sheer power, if not the presence yet. But Simonson decided to lean towards Loki and Thor. All of that said, the Masters of Evil died in Avengers issue 9. So how is there a one-shot about the team now? I honestly have no idea. Let's see if we can get some answers. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 12.16, The Masters of Evil. Heroes Reborn, Masters of Evil was published in February of 1999. It was written by Joe Casey, drawn by Charlie Adlard, and was colored by Kevin Sommers. It opens in a spare room, the only stuff inside of it some hospital equipment, and a bed. There are 2 men in the room, one inside of the bed and one sitting next to it, who is playing Battleship. The man in the bed is muscular, with short hair and blank eyes. He is incoherent, mumbling and gurgling, managing to croak out only one word. Ashima. The second man is middle-aged and dressed in a simple but nice business suit. His dark hair is swept back and graying at the temples. A thin goatee surrounds his mouth. He plays the Battleship game for them both, and shockingly, his opponent somehow misses him. But his attacks always seem to land a hit. He talks about how only great men, like he is, know the feeling of imminent power. Kings, generals, men who would sit amongst the gods? Yes, they all know it. His cell phone rings, and he answers it, identifying himself only as Garrett. On the other end is a man that he refers to as Cannon, and the plan hasn't gone as planned. The next panel shows the pointed white and green armor of Whirlwind. He explains that they couldn't find Krang's transport, so Dr. Liu came up with his own way to resolve things, and, Whirlwind says that he'll call Garrett back, and he hangs up the phone. Garrett pauses, but only for a moment. They'll figure it out. It'll work out. It has to work out. Destiny is at work now, and surely she favors him. He looks down at the board game again, and wins it. The man in the hospital bed murmurs again. Consummation, survival, dreaming. Garrett leans in, encouraging Bruno to speak. The doctors think nothing of his rambling, but Garrett, he can see what they cannot. They have no vision, but to him, the words are weapons. The story then jumps forward a bit. Garrett is now dressed as the Black Knight, sans his helmet, in black medieval European armor and cape with a falcon crest in yellow upon his chest. He stares at a large, twisting shell that sits upon a table inside of a dimly lit room. He looks up at his companion. What is this? The man on the other side of the table is dressed in a yellow mechanical suit that's filled with water. He is Krang, and we last saw him fanning the flames of war in Fantastic Four Volume 2, Issues 3 and 4, where he was encouraging Namor of Atlantis to drown New York City. The Fantastic Four managed to repel the attack, Namor promised to punish Krang, and the whale-like behemoth Giganto got blown up real good. Obviously, Krang survived, and he now offers the Black Knight the trumpet horn of Atlantis. With it, the Black Knight can summon Giganto from the depths to do his bidding, all in exchange for a simple favor. When asked why Krang offers this deal, he replies that it just serves his purposes for now. The Black Knight takes a moment to think this offer over, and then he accepts. Krang is happy to hear this. He won't regret it. The Atlan promises to return soon to discuss what he would like in return, but for now, their business is done. He and his guards leave, the Black Knight standing over the table, looking at the trumpet in silence. I gotta say, dude, you got ripped off. Author Joe Casey has a lot of ground to cover with his cast, so he makes some smart moves quickly. Putting the Melter, aka Bruno Horgan, in a coma takes him out of the big picture as a character or person, basically turning him into a plot device. What does the Melter have to do with prophecies and or random mumbling? I have no idea. Why is the Melter like this at all? I have no idea about that either. But he says Ashima and dreaming, which tie into what we've already seen established in the Heroes Reborn event books so far. Nathan Garrett is the Black Knight, and Casey quickly establishes a personality for him. He's arrogant and smug, proud of beating a comatose man in a board game, but foolish enough to make himself proud for doing so. He's sitting there thinking that he's a mastermind, as indicated by his comparing himself to generals and kings, but then he makes a deal for a trumpet horn that summons a dead monster, and he seems to have no idea what he'll be paying for it. Right away, Garrett feels like someone playing with forces that are beyond his control. And that's interesting. This guy might not be smart enough to realize how dumb he is, but at least that is more personality than he had in the Avengers. Casey and Adlard do these, scene-setting panels throughout the issue. They're just a single black square with text inside, and they're meant to indicate a time jump or a scene change, but they don't necessarily indicate that we are getting the story in a linear fashion. We'll learn later on that our opening scene with Bruno and Garrett actually happens towards the end of our issue, while this scene with Krang is actually amongst the earliest established. It sounds kind of rough while I'm explaining it, but the story is written clearly so that each scene eventually lines up somewhere else, revealing the timeline in its totality. It lends the issue a bit of a Tarantino-esque Reservoir Dogs kind of vibe, and, given its criminal leanings, it's pretty neat. So we then learn that this story is set in Chicago, through one of these boxes, and it has not been flooded. It's looking only like New York City got flooded, actually, not the whole world. Anyways, Whirlwind, aka David Cannon, takes over our narration. In a bit of irony, a guy named Whirlwind is actually a big fan of the Windy City. It's got good women, good blues, and good food, in that order. The only thing that he really dislikes are the winters, and how weird things are getting. Whirlwind sits inside of a cafe, eating as he talks. The other cafe patrons sit as far away from Whirlwind as possible as they can, but not because he is a dangerous supercriminal. No, they're scared of his companion, who is a large, muscular Chinese man named Chen Lu, who glows with a neon green light. This is the radioactive man, and he doesn't speak at all. Whirlwind does all of the talking here. The main point is to convey who Whirlwind is, and from his dialogue, he's a simple guy. He's a working stiff. Sure, I mean, he kills people for money, but that's just his job. All this no swearing, with the melter being hooked up to machines, and Garrett thinking that he's a prophet or something, it's too much. He does say that the melter changed after Loki, quote, spit him out, end quote. So we do get a bit of an explanation for how the Masters of Evil are alive. It's just all weird, and Whirlwind is starting to feel like a shadow creeping up his back. Just for the record, he is also unnerved by his companion's silence, as Radioactive Man never responds in this conversation. But Garrett said to take Radioactive Man along, and he is the one paying the bills, so a unlikely partnership they are. Although Whirlwind is pretty sure that he isn't having any kids soon. We then move to an underwater location where Krang and his 2 bodyguards sit in an undersea craft. They all have a good laugh at the Black Knight, who's walked right into Krang's trap. Giganto is dead, and using the horn will instead summon a horde of undersea monsters. This will displace enough water to flood the entire continent. Krang smiles at the thought. All he has to do is wait for that idiot to use it. But he won't get the chance. One of the Atlans reports that the water temperature is suddenly rising. It shoots up quickly, boiling the 3 of them alive in seconds. On the surface, Radioactive Man and Whirlwind are next to the waters of Lake Michigan, where the undersea craft was. Radioactive Man has his hands in the lake and is using his powers to heat the entire lake. This is where Whirlwind calls Garrett in the scene that we saw earlier, and he only hangs up because the dead bodies of hundreds of fish pop to the surface, as does the Atlan craft. Whirlwind looks to his partner. There's no way they're alive in there, right? Radioactive Man doesn't answer, so Whirlwind sighs. Yeah, they're probably dead. We'll assume that they are, that works. Having now eliminated Krang, the Black Knight visits Bruno once more, this time in costume. He talks about destiny and leaving a legacy and how they have carved out a kingdom here in Chicago. But he explains it is a king's destiny to sit amongst other kings, and so this city isn't enough for him. He's going to go to New York City, where he'll meet with another such king, and they can divvy up the world between them. But he doesn't want to go alone. The next morning, Whirlwind, sans his helmet, meets with 2 prospective new recruits, Boris Bulski and Anton Vanko, the Titanium Man and the Crimson Dynamo. These 2 gents last appeared in Iron Man Volume 2, Issue 10. Iron Man and Rebel dispatched the pair while they were on their way to face Hydra, but the pair of them were left alive, so I'm kind of glad to see them again. I have a weird character crush on these 2. Titanium Man is the largest man in the room, towering over Whirlwind and Crimson Dynamo in his thick green battlesuit, while the all-red Dynamo's armor is just a little bit taller than Whirlwind's. Whirlwind explains that Garrett is looking for escorts for his New York trip, so, do you guys have any experience in that line of work? The Titanium Man is like, duh, check this out, and he shoves the Crimson Dynamo. Dynamo responds by blasting him with red energy, and the pair start to brawl. Whirlwind sighs at the display as the 2 Russians continue fighting. He shouts for them to stop, and as they do, he congratulates them. They got the job. Then he tosses their paperwork aside as he leaves the room. He just can't take this kind of crazy stuff anymore. Elsewhere in Chicago, Radioactive Man sits inside of an empty barber shop, his eerie green glow the only light. Garrett is there as well, still in his armor. He explains to Radioactive Man that he's going to New York City, where he'll fulfill his destiny at last, but there's something that he needs to wrap up first. He's heard that a member of the family wants out of this life, and he can't have that. Not now, not when he's so close. There's only one thing to be done about it. Isn't there, Radioactive Man? Then the Black Knight leaves, and the Radioactive Man continues to sit in silence. In the flooded New York City, a black helicopter lands atop the Baxter Building, and as the Black Knight, Titanium Man, and Crimson Dynamo enter the building, Garrett does appreciate the irony here. As they walk further into the building, Garrett's heart swells in glee. Nothing moves to stop them, each door opening as they approach it. They were expected, and as far as he can tell, they are welcome. They reach the final door, and Garrett tells his escorts to wait for him here. For the first time, we can see that there is a case in his hands. Soon, he says, his destiny will be fulfilled. But not yet, because we return to Chicago first, where we find Whirlwind returning to his apartment. Garrett is in over his head, things are getting too weird, and Whirlwind's gut is screaming at him to go. He has made enough money to skip town for a while, maybe go west, and he starts to throw some clothes into his suitcase. Heck, no one is even gonna miss him. But then his gut starts screaming. Behind Whirlwind, in the darkness, is the silent radioactive man. Casey then runs our two narratives together, jumping back and forth between Whirlwind's story and the Black Knight's audience with Dr. Doom. I'm going to condense them both down for the ease of storytelling, but he does do some solid scene transitions between the two of them. While this is where things get a bit jumpy with the narrative, it is really well crafted and really well put together. I do feel a little bit like I'm doing the story a disservice by picking it apart, but that's kind of what the podcast is. The Black Knight enters a science-y looking room and finds Dr. Doom gazing out of a wall-sized window. He then makes his pitch, that the heroes are gone, maybe for good, and the world is theirs for the taking. Doom turns at this, and the Black Knight opens up the case that he has been carrying. Inside of it is the trumpet horn, a token to commemorate their alliance against their enemies. The Black Knight knows that it is Doom's destiny to rule the world. He has heard tell of it. He is sure of it. Just as he is sure of his place at Doom's side. Garrett takes off his helmet and kneels. There is only one other thing that he can offer, for surely only an intellect such as Doom's could understand its meaning, but he is willing to give it freely. Willingly. And Garrett says, Ashima. Doom looks at the door that the knight entered through. On the other side, magnets in the floor activate, trapping Titanium Man and Crimson Dynamo in place. An electrical burst floods their suits, killing them both where they stand. Inside, however, the knight has heard nothing. He waits for Doom to appoint him his place in the world. Impatient, he finally looks up and sees Doom's hand raised over his head, palm open. Doom doesn't say anything, but he does decide Garrett's place in the world. A bolt of crimson energy fires from Doom's hand, reducing the Black Knight and all of his dreams to ash. A monitor window appears on the glass behind Doom. As per the Master's orders, the intruders have been eliminated. Inside of that monitor window, Dr. Doom is pleased. He orders his servant to reveal itself, and the Doombot takes off its armored mask, revealing the workings underneath. This fool dared to speak of Ashima and didn't think that Doom would retaliate? He thought that Doom had equals? Such a thing is impossible. Back in Chicago, Radioactive Man towers over Whirlwind, his fists glowing with energy. At first, Whirlwind is confused, like, what is Radioactive Man doing here? But then the answer is actually kind of obvious. Garrett sent him, right? He sighs and sits down on the bed. He honestly thought that he could just leave, that no one would care. I mean, come on, they all have money, power, women. What else could they want? Why even bother killing him? Whirlwind guesses that once the capes were gone, no one expected that the crooks would turn on each other rather than just succeed. You just can't trust anyone anymore. And you know what? Fine. If that's the case, then what is the point of living? Whirlwind looks Radioactive Man in the face. It's his decision to make then. What is it going to be? And Radioactive Man just stares. Until the final page of the comic, we don't get to know what choice he makes. This is actually where the final moments with Doom happen, drawing out that lethal moment. But we do get to that final page, where we discover that Radioactive Man let Whirlwind go. He is now dressed in civilian clothes, on a train headed somewhere else. You see, the key to being a good crook is knowing when to cut your losses. He leans his head against the window, trying to think of, a lesson to be learned out of all this. But he's got nothing. So no swearing. Time to lay back, enjoy the breeze, and go wherever the wind may take him. As you can no doubt tell by now, this issue is fairly divorced from the story that Claremont had been telling so far with his set of one-shots. Yes, we do get to see Dr. Doom, and yes, there is a mention of Ashima, but otherwise, the events of Masters of Evil don't impact our main narrative at all. However, I actually don't have as much of a problem with that here as I did compared to Ashima. Ashima didn't focus enough on its title character, or push our narrative forward enough to really satisfy me, where the Masters of Evil remain solely focused on its title characters, even if it didn't push our narrative forward. But you give me an interesting enough story with interesting enough characters, and that is a trade that I'm willing to make. Author Joe Casey basically boils the Masters of Evil down to two main members, Garrett the Black Knight and Whirlwind. The Melter and Radioactive Man are relatively sidelined, so let's work our way through them first. The Melter ends up with the worst deal here, practically comatose, his life sustained only by machines, and only at the whim of his friend, Garrett. And now that Garrett is dead and Whirlwind is gone, I can't help but wonder what's going to happen to him. Whirlwind establishes that the Melter, and I'm guessing the rest of the Masters, were spat back out by Loki, which I'm assuming happened when Loki died. That is not something that was established when he died at all, and if that is the case, then it means a lot of supervillains, and the Swordsman, got brought back from the dead. How the Master survived isn't really important to this particular story, and it's a continuity error that isn't ever properly addressed, so it is something that bothers me. But the very nature of the Reborn Earth has kind of always been subject to change as well. The fundamental rules of it have never really been solidified. So despite not really explaining anything, I'm also kind of willing to accept this kind of continuity error. Radioactive Man gets the second backseat role, but he still plays an important character role. His constant silence means that we never get into his head. We never know what motivates him. This is important because Garrett sends him after Whirlwind, and Whirlwind has to talk him out of the murder. And when we get to that moment, things could go either way. Watching Dr. Liu's superheat Lake Michigan earlier in the issue shows us that he is efficient and cold-hearted. Regardless of the cost to the natural world, he would see the job done. And so he potentially ruined an entire lake in order to do so. When he towers over Whirlwind at the end, ready to kill him, we have no reason to think that he is going to do otherwise. And so, when he spares Whirlwind, we're both surprised and relieved. But that emotional reaction wouldn't have happened if we'd heard from Dr. Liu throughout the story, or had heard him narrate his decision, so keeping him silent is a smart move. His sparing Whirlwind comes as a relief because, honestly, I like this interpretation of the character. There's definitely a likable crook or rogue or scoundrel stereotype, and I think that Whirlwind falls into that category perfectly. His narration sounds like a normal guy, just trying to enjoy his life as best he can, and he can feel the winds beginning to shift on him, pun intended. He became a hired killer in order to make money and enjoy his life, and while we, as an audience, aren't hired killers, as far as you all know, isn't that what we all want to do? To make a living and enjoy our lives? The down-to-earth nature of Whirlwind kinda makes us root for him, especially as he continually grows more annoyed at how super his supervillain life is getting. When he decides to get out, I'm honestly kinda happy for him, and when he lives at the end, I'm super relieved. Plus, there's a perfect story balance between Whirlwind and Garrett. As I mentioned earlier, there's an arrogance to Garrett, and obviously a cruelty as well. He's using the Melter for information, using Radioactive Man and Whirlwind to kill his enemies, and now that he's ready to step up and ally with Dr. Doom, he's also comfortable abandoning them all. He even hires on new help, new armored help, which I think is an important detail, when he makes his big pitch. There was no way that Titanium Man and Crimson Dynamo were hired in order to threaten Doom. They were there to make Garrett seem important and, in my opinion, appeal to Doom's own armored proclivities. I mean, why wouldn't Garrett bring the Radioactive Man? Why not bring Whirlwind? And it's because Garrett is eager to leave them behind, along with the life that he used to lead, in order to advance his own cause. Obviously, that backfires on him, and that's due to the balance that Casey puts between his two lead characters. Garrett is a man who thinks that life owes him more. He spends this whole issue talking about his destiny and his fate and how it's to sit on a throne with other kings and lord over humanity. He isn't excited because he has an opportunity to do so. He is excited that he knows that it's going to happen. Remember, it's destiny. It's out of his control, actually. He can't do anything to change this. Garrett is someone who has everything that he has ever wanted, which we're told several times, but he is sure that he can have more. Meanwhile, Whirlwind is a man with everything that he's ever wanted, and he's fine with that. He just wants to be a super crook and enjoy life, and that balance is very interesting to me. Casey ends up telling us basically that overreaching for more than you can handle will literally doom you, while accepting your lot in life can lead to happiness and survival. And while that's not perhaps the greatest feel-good moral that I've ever seen, in a world like the Reborn Earth, perhaps survival is the best that one can hope for. Doom's behavior is on point in this comic, though, although Casey does have a bit more of a melodramatic edge to his voice than Chris Claremont does. As I mentioned when Doom was interacting with Lancer, he doesn't see anyone in this world, or the normal 616 Earth, as his equal. Reed Richards is the closest person that he would admit, and even there, he isn't Doom's equal, he's just the closest. But where Doom can manipulate Lancer and her more emotional needs, Garrett is someone who would only want more and more out of this partnership. Remember, Doom does plan on allying with other powers. We have seen him ally with Dorma already, and he has stated that he has an interest in allying with 2 other forces as well. But after hearing Garrett's pitch, he still kills him. Because despite humbling himself before Doom, he has still claimed more than his due. He claimed that he was Doom's equal, and that's absurd. I do want to point out really quickly that the Titanium Man and Crimson Dynamo, in their last Heroes Reborn appearance, were defending Hydra, which was revealed to be run by the Mandarin, who was revealed to be Dr. Doom. So there's something kind of fitting about him killing them both here. They've already failed Doom once before when they allowed Iron Man and Rebel to approach the Hydra base, and they've pretty much demonstrated their stupidity. I think this is interesting because we have seen that Doom doesn't have many allies, and he is building a power base, so you would think that the 2 more relatively powerful suits of armor on his side would be a welcome thing. Plus, they're kind of dumb, so it's not like he couldn't manipulate them. But like I said, I think that Doom has more faith in someone that he can control, and who has a more emotional stake in Doom's actual conquering, like Lancer, and someone who hasn't failed him so far. Whereas Crimson Dynamo and Titanium Man have not only failed Doom, but they're kinda just big thugs. So, these 2 get fried. Sorry, guys. Overall, I'm really pleased with author Joe Casey's work on this one-shot. While some of the background material, like how the Masters of Evil survived, is just hand-waved over, the rest of this issue is pretty strong. The characters are interesting and well-written, and while the time-jumping is a bit confusing at first, it all comes together nicely in a tight package at the end. There's drama, there's comedy, there's a well-crafted narrative. Yeah, this reads well. Charlie Adlard isn't a name that you see too often in the world of superhero comics these days, but he is a big name artistically, having risen to fame working on Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead for Image Comics. Now, Adlard wasn't the original artist on The Walking Dead, that would be Tony Moore, but I do think that book only really solidified what it was under Adlard's pen. He pencils and inks himself in this issue, and he sticks to a lot of solid blacks and straight lines. All of his characters look very human too, like when Whirlwind takes off his mask, he has bags under his eyes and wrinkles and a receding hairline. He looks like a working stiff, and that helps sell the idea that he's just a guy doing a job and trying to get by. Conversely, Garrett's widow's peak and gray temples and suit give him that arrogant air that I mentioned. The second that I saw Garrett, I really wanted to wipe that smug grin off his face. Adlard also has a much more sketchier, thinner line than we have seen so far, so his work feels a bit more realistic. The shot of Garrett's helicopter flying over the flooded New York City is a great shot, and perhaps best captures the hopeless situation that New York City finds itself in. That said, this issue does make me a bit confused as to the flooding in general. Admittedly, the only places that we've been told are flooded are New York City and San Francisco. I guess I had just assumed that if those areas were flooded, then everything else was flooded. But that doesn't seem to be the case, especially if Chicago is still around and Whirlwind is taking a train out west. So I actually found a sea level rising simulator online and played around with it to kind of see how close this situation would be, and honestly, it's kind of fairly legit. Sea levels would need to rise by 30 feet or more in order to completely cover the island of Manhattan, like we have been shown, and yeah, that would mean that most of San Francisco was flooded as well. Florida was like totally underwater, although most of the west and central portions of the United States were fine. So that's kind of interesting, actually. I would like to see a map of the Reborn Earth, because that's the kind of detail-oriented nerd that I am, but, well, we can't get everything. As isolated in our narrative as this issue is, it's an enjoyable issue overall. The characters are a huge step up from their portrayals in Avengers Volume 2, they are interesting and dynamic, and they play off of each other well, and the book's darker, more human focus helps add to the ground-level crime story that we got. While this isn't an earth-shattering issue, hell, it doesn't even impact on Doom's overall narrative, this was a good comic and a solid read. I can only hope that the rest of the Heroes Reborn event books read this well. Whirlwind claims to be headed out west, and that's actually where we're headed next. While I kind of wish that we were following his story, we aren't. We're actually meeting a new character with a familiar name in familiar armor, as he battles new versions of old enemies while hunting for the love of his life. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 12.17, Rebel.
Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me, to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.